My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I have been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's steady ground. If you met me at a neighborhood dinner in Manchester, you would probably describe me as kind, maybe soft spoken, possibly a bit too patient. I've always had that face people feel safe confessing to, the kind that nods gently, the kind that remembers everyone's allergies, birthdays, and preferred tea. What people rarely notice is that I also remember patterns. I'm married for love, real love, the kind that makes you believe that loyalty is a language and commitment is a shelter. I stayed for responsibility, for the mortgage, for the children, for the version of myself who believed endurance was the highest form of devotion. And somewhere between those two decisions, I began to question everything in between. This isn't a story about dramatic betrayals or explosive arguments. There were no shattered plates, no screaming matches, no villains standing in the rain. This is about something quieter. It's about the slow erosion of being underestimated, about how small dismissals, when repeated often enough, become a role you're expected to perform, about how a woman can be deeply loved and quietly diminished at the same time. For years, I told myself that staying was a strength, that absorbing discomfort was maturity, that silence meant peace. And then one day, without any announcement, something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not angrily, just clearly. What follows is not revenge. It's not a cautionary tale about men or marriage or modern life. It's an honest documentation of what happens when a woman who has always been seen as gentle begins to see herself differently. I won't exaggerate, I won't dramatize, and I won't pretend I was perfect. But I will tell you the truth about what it feels like to realize that letting go isn't always easier than staying. Sometimes staying costs you your voice, and sometimes reclaiming it doesn't look the way anyone expects. Have you ever stayed somewhere longer than you should have? Not because you were weak, but because you believed it was the right thing to do. To my husband, I was the steady one. That's how Daniel introduced me to people. Not with malice, not dismissively, just efficiently. This is Clara. She keeps everything running. At first, I thought it was a compliment. Stability is admirable. Reliability is rare. I wore the title like a badge of honor. I paid the bills on time. I remembered the dentist appointments. I packed lunches with little notes folded into napkins. I ironed shirts the night before important meetings. I knew the Wi Fi password, the children's shoe sizes, and the exact amount left on our mortgage. But slowly, I began to notice something. Steady meant predictable. Predictable meant unquestioning. Unquestioning meant silent. In social settings, Daniel spoke for both of us. If someone asked about holiday plans, he answered. If someone asked about the children's schooling, he answered. If someone joked about marriage, he laughed and said, Clara doesn't mind. She's easy. Easy. I smiled every time. It wasn't that he was cruel. He wasn't. That would have been simpler to name. It was subtler than that. He had a bigger personality, louder, faster, more charismatic. People gravitated toward him. I stood slightly behind, nodding, refilling glasses, finishing stories he forgot halfway through. At school pickup, other parents saw me as organized, capable. You're so lucky, Daniel, one mother once said in front of him. She's got everything under control. He laughed. I know, I'd be lost without her. It sounded affectionate. But what I heard was this: she'll always be here. I became the default, the emotional default, the logistical default, the quiet absorber of tension. When Daniel was stressed from work, I adjusted my tone. When money felt tight, I cut back on my own needs first. When he forgot something important, I reminded him without ever saying, "You forgot." I wasn't invisible, I was indispensable. And there's a difference. Invisible means unseen, indispensable means taken for granted. People don't thank the foundation of a house, they assume it will hold. At family gatherings, I sat beside his mother while she critiqued how busy Daniel was becoming. "He works so hard," she'd sigh, as if I were merely a supportive prop in the background of his ambition. No one asked what I gave up to accommodate his late meetings. No one noticed that my part time hours stayed part time because someone had to be available for school emergencies. I didn't resent it, not then, because I believed love meant balance over time. That sacrifices evened out eventually. That partnership was cyclical. But looking back, I can see the shape of the dynamic forming long before I acknowledged it. Daniel made decisions. I made adjustments. He expanded. I accommodated. And because I never protested, everyone assumed I was perfectly content in that role, including him. The truth is, I was content for a while, until I began to realize that the version of me they relied on was not the full version of me. It was the edited one, the softened one, the one who believed that if she stayed calm enough, kind enough, useful enough, she would always be valued. What I didn't yet understand was this: value without voice is a fragile thing, and I had been quiet for so long that no one knew I had thoughts that didn't orbit around them. Not even me. If you ask me when it began, I won't say it was the day I found a secret or uncovered a lie. It was smaller than that. So small that, at the time, I almost felt embarrassed for noticing. It happened on a Thursday evening in early autumn. The children were upstairs, arguing about whose turn it was to feed the hamster. I was at the kitchen table with my navy leather notebook open, reviewing our monthly expenses. Daniel had been talking for weeks about investing in a new venture with a colleague, something in property development. He was excited, animated, restless in the way he gets when he senses growth. "I think this could be big," he said, pacing lightly, phone in a hand. "It's a smart move." I listened carefully. I always did. And because I've always been meticulous with numbers, I asked a few questions, gently, not critically. What would the initial outlay be? Would we be personally liable? Have you seen the contract draft? They weren't accusations, they were practicalities. Daniel stopped pacing. He didn't look angry, just faintly irritated. "Clara," he exhaled, half smiling, "you worry too much. It's not that complicated." I felt the first shift then, a tightening in my chest I couldn't immediately explain. "I'm not worried," I said calmly. "I just want to understand the structure." He waved a hand dismissively. "It's business stuff. You don't need to get into the weeds with it." Business stuff, as though I hadn't been managing our household accounts for over a decade. As though I didn't know our interest rates by heart. As though I hadn't quietly helped him restructure a loan 2 years earlier by noticing a clause he'd missed. I closed the notebook slowly. "Of course," I said. The conversation moved on. Dinner was served. The children came downstairs. Life resumed its rhythm. But something lingered. It wasn't what he said. It was how easily he said it. The assumption embedded in the sentence. "You don't need to know." I replayed it that night while brushing my teeth. Not angrily, just analytically. Was he protecting me from stress or excluding me from influence? The difference matters. The next week, At a dinner party with two of his colleagues and their wives, the subject came up again. Daniel was animated, explaining projections and timelines. One of the wives turned to me. Are you excited about it? I opened my mouth to answer. Daniel answered first. She trusts me, he said lightly. Don't you? Everyone laughed. I smiled. Of course, I replied. But trust and exclusion are not synonyms. That was the first small cut. No blood, no drama, no argument afterward in the car. Just a quiet realization. My questions were being reframed as worry. My involvement was being reduced to emotional support. And because I didn't challenge it, the narrative solidified. Clara doesn't need the details. Clara prefers simplicity. Clara is steady. That night, after everyone was asleep, I reopened my notebook, not to confront him, just to start paying closer attention to tone, to patterns, to whom our decisions made, and who gets informed afterward. It still wasn't resentment. It was curiosity. But curiosity, when paired with memory, becomes awareness. And awareness, once it arrives, doesn't leave. Looking back, I sometimes think that was the moment the foundation shifted. Not because something catastrophic happened, but because I stopped assuming I was standing on equal ground. It's strange how the first crack in a structure is almost always silent. No one else heard it, but I did. After that Thursday, nothing outwardly changed. Daniel still kissed my forehead before leaving for work. I still texted him reminders about school assemblies. We still sat on the same sofa in the evenings, the television murmuring between us. But something subtle had been introduced into the atmosphere, a hierarchy, not declared, not negotiated, just assumed. The property venture moved forward. Papers were signed, meetings were scheduled. I learned about most of it in fragments, comments made in passing, phone calls taken in the hallway, celebratory remarks about progress. When I asked how it was going, Daniel gave summaries. Good, busy, promising. If I asked for specifics, the answers became thinner. It's technical. It would bore you. I've got it handled. Each phrase landed softly. No sharp edges, no cruelty. But repetition turns softness into weight. The second small moment came a few weeks later when a letter arrived from the bank. I happened to collect the post that morning. It was addressed jointly to both of us. I didn't open it immediately. I placed it on his desk in the study. That evening, I saw it open, folded back carelessly. Oh, I said gently. Was that about the new loan structure? Daniel looked up from his laptop. Yeah, just formalities. Do you want to go over it together? He hesitated. Just a flicker. It's sorted, Clara. I already signed. Already signed. I stood there for a moment, processing. It was in both our names, I said carefully. I know, he replied. But it's routine. I didn't want to drag you into the admin. Drag me into the admin. I nodded. And then I did something I had done countless times before. I rationalized. He's busy. He's under pressure. He's trying to grow something for the family. Don't make this about ego. That's how normalization works. Not through force, through internal editing. You begin to trim your reactions before anyone else has to. At school pickup, another mother asked how the investment was going. I realized Daniel had been discussing it publicly. Oh, I'm not really involved, I said lightly. She tilted her head. That's nice. Less stress for you. Less stress. I smiled again. But I wasn't less stressed. I was less informed. And there's a difference. At dinner one evening, Daniel mentioned he'd be traveling to London more frequently to meet partners. It was stated as fact, not a discussion. I'll make it work with the kids, I said automatically. He squeezed my hand. I knew you would. That phrase used to feel like appreciation. Now it felt like a prediction. I began noticing how often my compliance was anticipated, not requested, anticipated. And because I had always been reliable, my reliability was no longer remarkable. It was baseline, expected, silent. The real shift, though, wasn't external, it was internal. I stopped asking certain questions out loud. Instead, I wrote them down. In my Navy notebook, I began recording dates, loan amounts. Business names are mentioned casually. Travel schedules. Not obsessively, methodically. Not because I suspected betrayal, but because I realized something important. If I wasn't being included in decisions, I needed to understand them independently. Silence at first had been emotional, a desire to keep peace. Now it was observational. I watched how easily my absence from the decision making space was justified as kindness. She doesn't need the stress. She trusts me. She prefers focusing on the children. No one asked me if that was true, and I didn't correct them, because correcting them would require confrontation. And confrontation felt disproportionate. After all, nothing terrible had happened. There were no affairs, no screaming matches, no financial collapse, just a pattern of gentle diminishment. And the most dangerous thing about gentle diminishment is this: it's easy to live inside it. It doesn't bruise, it erodes, slowly enough that you adjust your footing instead of questioning the ground. By the end of that winter, I had become exceptionally calm, more agreeable than ever, more supportive, more quiet. And everyone seemed pleased, including Daniel. What they didn't notice was that my silence was no longer automatic, it was deliberate. And deliberate silence is very different from submission. There's a moment, subtle, almost administrative, when you realize you've been cast in a role you never formally agreed to play. For me, it wasn't one dramatic revelation. It was a series of small confirmations. By early spring, Daniel's business commitments had expanded. Dinners out, weekends reviewing numbers, increased calls taken outside on the patio with his voice lowered just enough to imply importance. I adapted, as I always had. I rearranged the children's schedules. I swapped shifts at school. I told friends, it's a busy season for him. And every time I said it, I felt myself solidifying into something predictable. At a family lunch, his mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You're so good for him, Clara, she said warmly. He needs someone stable, someone who doesn't complicate things. Doesn't complicate things. It was meant as praise, but I felt it land like a label. Stable, undemanding, low maintenance. The kind of woman who absorbs unpredictability so others can pursue it. Later that afternoon, Daniel and his brother were discussing expansion plans in the living room. I brought in tea, set it down quietly, and began to leave. Clara, his brother called casually. You're not going to start grilling him about risk percentages again, are you? He laughed. Daniel smiled but didn't correct him. It's handled, Daniel said lightly. Handled. I paused for a fraction of a second, not long enough for anyone to notice. And then I smiled back. Of course, I replied. That was the moment. Not because they were cruel, but because I saw it clearly. I had been categorized, not as a partner in growth, not as an intellectual equal, but as the emotional infrastructure, the support beam, the safe harbor, the one who keeps the home steady while the ship sails. And here's the complicated truth. I had participated in building that perception. I had minimized my own competence to make room for his confidence. I had softened my questions to avoid being seen as obstructive. I had chosen harmony over influence so consistently that harmony became my assigned function. The role wasn't forced on me, it crystallized around me. That night, while folding laundry, I thought about the early years of our marriage. Back then, we used to debate everything: politics, books, future plans. Daniel admired my insight. He'd say, "You think in layers." Somewhere along the line, layered thinking became overthinking. Insight became worry. Engagement became stress. I tried to pinpoint when it shifted. Was it after the children were born? When did I reduce my hours at work? When his income surpassed mine? Or had the shift been gradual enough that neither of us noticed? The next week, a friend asked if I ever considered returning to full time work. "You're too capable to stay small," she said gently. I laughed it off. "I'm not small," I replied. But the sentence lingered, because capability without authority feels smaller than it should. That evening, Daniel mentioned attending a financial planning seminar in London, something advanced. "You'd hate it," he said, almost teasing. "Very numbers heavy." I looked at him steadily. "I don't hate numbers," I said calmly. He blinked, slightly surprised, as if remembering something he'd forgotten about me. "Right," he said. "Well, it's probably full anyway." "Probably," I nodded. And in that moment, I understood my assigned role with unsettling clarity. I was the woman who would adjust, the woman who would understand, the woman who would stay supportive no matter how decisions were made, reliable, useful, invisible in rooms where direction was set. But something else had begun forming underneath that role. Not rebellion, not resentment, just awareness. And awareness has weight. Because once you see the structure of a dynamic, once you recognize the part you've been playing, you can't unknow it. You can continue performing it, or you can begin, quietly, to reconsider the script. That spring, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand inclusion. I didn't argue. I simply stopped believing that the role they'd assigned me was the only one available. And that belief, silent and internal, was the beginning of something none of us yet understood. The day everything shifted did not look important from the outside. It was raining. The kind of steady Manchester rain that makes the sky feel lower than usual. The children were at school. Daniel was in London for meetings. The house was quiet in that rare mid-morning way that almost feels borrowed. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my navy notebook open, reviewing the previous month's expenses. Not obsessively, just habitually. A transfer caught my attention, a large one. It wasn't unfamiliar. I'd seen similar figures connected to the property venture. But this one had moved from our joint account into a separate business account I didn't recognize. I didn't feel panic. I felt focused. I logged into the online banking portal and followed the trail carefully. The account was connected to the venture, yes, but structured differently than I'd assumed. There were layers, sub-entities, guarantees tied more personally to Daniel than he'd ever mentioned. And to me, my name appeared in documentation I'd never reviewed. That was the moment. Not because he had stolen from me, not because he was having an affair, but because I realized that my legal exposure was expanding while my informational access was shrinking. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the rain on the window. For years, I had believed that silence was maturity, that trust meant stepping back, that love required deference in areas where the other person felt stronger. But this wasn't deference, it was detachment from decisions that could fundamentally alter my future. I walked into the study and opened the filing cabinet. Daniel wasn't secretive. He simply assumed I wouldn't look closely. Contracts were stacked neatly, folders labeled in his tidy handwriting. I sat on the floor and began reading, not emotionally, methodically. By the time I finished the third document, something inside me had settled into place. Not anger, not betrayal, clarity. Daniel wasn't malicious. He wasn't plotting against me. He genuinely believed he was protecting me from complexity. But protection without consent becomes control, even if it's unintentional. And I had allowed that narrative to flourish because it felt easier than asserting otherwise. I made tea, sat back down at the kitchen table, opened my notebook to a fresh page. And instead of writing questions, I wrote a decision: understand everything, not to accuse, not to threaten, but to know. For the first time in years, I felt something steady that wasn't about maintaining peace. It was about maintaining position. I realized that I had been emotionally responsible for the family, but not strategically positioned within it. If something went wrong, financially, legally, I would absorb the consequences without having shaped the decisions. That was no longer acceptable to me, not dramatically, not loudly, just internally. When Daniel called that evening, animated about a successful meeting, I listened the way I always did. "That's great," I said warmly. And it was genuine. But while he spoke, I noticed something new. I wasn't waiting for him to finish so I could support. I was listening to assess. The shift wasn't visible. It didn't change my tone. It didn't alter my posture. But internally, the axis had moved. I no longer saw myself as the background stabilizer of his expansion. I saw myself as an independent stakeholder. And stakeholders do not operate on blind trust. They operate on information. That night, after the children were asleep, I ordered 3 books on property finance and small business liability. I didn't tell him, not because it was secretive, but because, for the first time, I understood that my growth did not require permission. Letting go isn't always easier than staying. And at that moment, I hadn't decided to let go of anything. I had decided to stay, but differently. There's a difference between being quiet because you feel small and being quiet because you're gathering strength. Before, my silence had been reactive. I stayed calm to avoid tension. I softened my questions to preserve harmony. I deferred because it felt loving. After that rainy morning, my silence changed shape. It became intentional. The books arrived 3 days later. I placed them on my bedside table without comment. At night, after Daniel fell asleep, I read. Not hurriedly, not obsessively, just steadily. Terminology I once pretended not to care about began forming into structure in my mind. Liability chains, equity splits, risk exposure, personal guarantees. It wasn't foreign to me. It was familiar ground I had stepped away from years ago. When motherhood demanded more of my time, I realized something quietly empowering. I had never lacked capacity. I had simply redirected it. Daniel noticed my late night reading once. "What are you studying?" he asked casually, brushing his teeth. "Just brushing up on finance," I replied lightly. He chuckled. "Planning to audit me?" The old version of me would have reassured him instantly. "Don't be silly." "Of course not." Instead, I smiled. "Just staying informed." He nodded, unconcerned, because he still believed information was optional for me. That assumption became my advantage. Over the next few weeks, I asked fewer spontaneous questions. I didn't interrupt his stories with clarifications. I didn't request updates unless he offered them first. To anyone watching, I looked more supportive than ever. Daniel seemed relaxed around me. He spoke freely, assuming I wasn't tracking details. But I was, not emotionally, strategically. I began organizing digital copies of our financial documents, downloading statements, reviewing loan structures, mapping connections between entities. I updated my notebook carefully: dates, signatures, terms. Not in a frantic way, in a composed way. Silence, when paired with preparation, is unsettlingly powerful. The interesting thing about strategic quiet is that others interpret it as agreement. At a dinner with his business partner and his wife, the conversation turned toward expansion again. Clara's our grounding force, Daniel joked. If she's not panicking, we're fine. Everyone laughed. I held my wine glass steadily. I don't panic, I said calmly. And it was true. Panic clouds judgment. I was clearer than I had been in years. Daniel mistook my composure for compliance. He interpreted my lack of visible concern as faith. In reality, it was an assessment. I started attending free online seminars about small business law during school hours. I reconnected with an old university acquaintance, now a financial advisor, under the guise of curiosity. We had coffee. We spoke generally. I didn't disclose everything, but I asked the right hypothetical questions. What happens if a spouse signs something they didn't fully review? How exposed can personal assets become in layered structures? What protections are available after the fact? I wasn't planning an exit. Not yet. I was building understanding. At home, I became almost softer, less reactive, less insistent. Daniel seemed grateful. You've been really easy lately, he said one night, wrapping an arm around me on the sofa. Easy. The word no longer irritated me because I knew something he didn't. Ease can be camouflage. I wasn't withdrawing affection. I wasn't punishing him with distance. If anything, I felt more grounded, more observant, less emotionally entangled in daily fluctuations. For the first time, I could see our dynamic from above rather than from inside it. And from that vantage point, patterns were obvious. Daniel didn't exclude me out of malice. He excluded me out of habit, reinforced by my historical acceptance. Habits can be changed, but not by argument alone. They shift when consequences shift. I wasn't ready for consequences yet, but I was positioning myself for choice. Because the most powerful shift that occurred that spring wasn't about knowledge. It was about agency. For years, staying had felt like a duty. Now, staying felt like a strategy. And strategy requires patience. They thought my silence meant I trusted them completely. In reality, it meant I trusted myself enough to wait. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't slam doors or issue ultimatums. It happens in ordinary rooms, under ordinary lighting, while the rest of the world assumes nothing has changed. That spring, from the outside, I was the most agreeable version of myself I'd ever been. I packed overnight bags for Daniel's London trips without comment. I reminded him of early trains. I texted him good luck before the meetings. When he came home animated and tired, I listened, not interrupting, not probing. He relaxed around me in a way he hadn't in months. What he didn't notice was that I had stopped reacting emotionally to his updates. I listened the way an analyst listens, not suspicious, not cold, attentive. I began building a quiet archive. Every contract I could legally access, I copied and organized digitally. I created a spreadsheet mapping personal guarantees, projected returns, and repayment schedules. I noted which assets were secured against which loans. In the afternoons, while the children were at school, I sat at the kitchen table with tea going cold beside me and taught myself what I had once assumed was too complicated. It wasn't complicated, it was layered, and layers reward patience. I discovered that one of the newer loans had cross collateralization clauses, meaning if one entity defaulted, others could be affected, including assets connected to our home. Not immediately, not recklessly, but technically possible. I didn't panic. I calculated. Daniel had always described the venture as ambitious but controlled. What I was seeing was ambitious and leveraged. There's a difference. One evening, while folding laundry, I overheard him on the patio speaking to his partner. If we stretch now, we dominate later, he said confidently. Stretch now. The phrase echoed in my mind. Stretch with whose safety net? I realized something important that week. Risk feels different when you're the one betting and when you're the one securing the bet. Daniel felt energized by expansion. I felt the quiet tremor of exposure. But instead of confronting him immediately, I did something else. I opened a separate savings account in my name only. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't secretive in a malicious way. It was precautionary. A modest amount transferred from personal income I'd set aside over the years. Tutoring fees, small inheritances, birthday gifts never spent. For the first time in a decade, I created financial space that wasn't shared, not to hide, to breathe. I also scheduled a consultation with a solicitor, framed generally as understanding marital financial structures in business partnerships. I didn't walk in angry. I walked in informed. The solicitor listened carefully, asked precise questions, and then said something that stayed with me. Protection isn't distrust, it's clarity. Clarity, that word again. At home, Daniel noticed nothing unusual. Why would he? The dinners were still cooked, the children still laughed. I still touched his arm when he passed by. But internally, I was repositioning. I updated beneficiaries, reviewed insurance policies, confirmed which signatures were legally binding and which required dual consent. Not because I wanted to dismantle our marriage, but because I no longer accept being structurally vulnerable. The most interesting shift, though, was emotional. As I prepared, I felt less resentment, not more. Knowledge removed ambiguity. And ambiguity had been fueling quiet anxiety for months. The more I understood, the calmer I became. Daniel misread that calm as renewed devotion. You seem lighter lately, he said one Sunday morning while we watched the children play in the garden. I feel clearer, I replied. He smiled, assuming the clarity was about us. In truth, it was about me. For years, I had equated love with endurance. Now I was beginning to understand that love without awareness becomes imbalance. What they never noticed was that I was changing. It was that I was strengthening, quietly, methodically, without announcement. Because power doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation. And by the time anyone realizes preparation has been happening, the ground has already shifted beneath them. The reveal didn't happen in a dramatic office with documents slammed onto a desk. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in complete silence. I had scheduled another meeting with the solicitor, this time bringing copies of specific contracts. Not because I suspected fraud, not because I wanted to accuse Daniel of deception, but because I wanted certainty. We sat across from each other in a modest conference room. No theatrics, just paper, highlighters, and measured questions. She read carefully, paused, turned a page. Then she looked at me and asked, "Did you sign this knowingly?" I recognized my signature immediately, but I didn't recognize the context. It had been embedded within a stack of refinancing documents Daniel had asked me to sign months earlier. He'd summarized them as routine restructuring. I had skimmed, trusted, and signed. The clause in question linked our primary residence as contingent collateral if certain liquidity thresholds weren't met in the business. Not immediately, not recklessly, but legally possible. The solicitor explained it calmly. If projections hold, there's no issue, she said. But if the venture overextends and defaults across linked entities, your home could be exposed. I felt no rush of heat, no trembling hands, just stillness. And I can't remove that risk retroactively? I asked. Not without renegotiation or restructuring, she replied. And that would require full transparency between you and your husband. Full transparency. There it was. The private reveal wasn't that Daniel had betrayed me. It was that I had been structurally repositioned without fully understanding the implications. He hadn't hidden it maliciously, he had minimized it because he believed complexity was his burden to carry. What he didn't realize was that he had quietly transferred portions of that burden onto me, legally, financially, existentially, without informed consent. I left the office and sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. Letting go isn't always easier than staying. And in that moment, I understood something deeply uncomfortable. Staying, as things were structured, meant accepting risk I hadn't chosen. For years, I had absorbed emotional labor. Now I was absorbing financial exposure. That wasn't a partnership, that was asymmetry. On the drive home, I didn't rehearse confrontation. I didn't plan accusations. Instead, I began outlining options. Option 1: confront him immediately, demand restructuring, force clarity. Option 2: continue observing, gather leverage, wait for the right timing. Option 3: protect myself independently before initiating any structural shifts. The solicitor had mentioned something else, almost in passing. If you ever needed to negotiate from strength, she'd said, documentation and independent counsel are your allies. Negotiate from strength. The phrase settled into me like a foundation stone. At home, Daniel was already back from London, sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone. How was your day? He asked casually. Productive, I replied. And it was. I watched him differently that evening. Not suspiciously, but clearly. He was confident, forward moving, certain that expansion justified temporary strain. He believed he was building something for us, but he hadn't paused to ask whether I wanted to build it this way. That night, lying beside him, I realized the full shape of my leverage. I understood the financial web. I had independent legal insight. I had documented patterns of unilateral decisions, and I had begun quietly creating my own financial buffer. Power isn't loud, it's the ability to choose. For the first time in years, I felt choice expanding rather than shrinking. Not because I wanted to destroy what we had, but because I now understand its architecture. And once you understand the architecture of your life, you stop mistaking walls for destiny. The private reveal wasn't rage, it was clarity, sharpened into capability. I didn't cry, I didn't confront, I didn't withdraw affection. I simply moved from a supportive spouse to an informed stakeholder. And Daniel still had no idea the balance of awareness had shifted. Clarity is powerful, but clarity without action eventually becomes self betrayal. For several weeks after the solicitors' meeting, I lived in a quiet state of evaluation. Nothing outwardly changed. Daniel continued expanding the venture. The children continued asking for help with homework. Life moved in its familiar rhythm. Inside, I was running scenarios. If the business succeeded, we would benefit financially. Yes, but the structural imbalance would remain. He would continue making high-risk decisions unilaterally, assuming my compliance. If the business faltered, our home could be exposed. My security, the children's security, would depend on contingencies I hadn't shaped. If I confronted him now, directly and emotionally, he might interpret it as distrust, as fear, as interference. If I waited too long, my leverage would shrink. Every option carried cost. Letting go isn't always easier than staying, and I realized something unsettling. I wasn't deciding whether to leave my marriage. I was deciding whether to remain structurally vulnerable inside it. One evening, Daniel came home unusually energized. We're considering accelerating the third acquisition, he said, dropping his bag by the door. If we move quickly, we can lock in before competitors react. Accelerating. I felt the weight of that word immediately. Does that increase our exposure? I asked calmly. He hesitated for half a second. Just enough. Temporarily, he said. But it's calculated. Calculated by whom? I didn't press. I didn't argue. Instead, I nodded. Have you factored in liquidity buffers? I asked. He looked at me with mild surprise. Of course, he replied a bit defensively. But I could tell he hadn't expected the question framed that way. That was the moment I understood something critical. He didn't see me as opposition. He saw me as reassurance, which meant he wasn't preparing for resistance. And resistance, when unexpected, carries weight. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen with my notebook open. I wrote 3 sentences. I will not remain uninformed. I will not remain unprotected. I will not threaten what I am not prepared to change. The third sentence mattered most, because once you initiate structural confrontation, legal, financial, marital, you alter the dynamic permanently. There is no returning to innocence after that. So I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. If he refuses to restructure transparently, am I prepared to leave? Not emotionally, legally, logistically, practically. The answer wasn't immediate, but it was forming. I reviewed the savings account I'd opened. Modest, but growing. I reviewed the solicitor's notes on post-nuptial agreements and asset separation structures. I reviewed timelines on refinancing windows. And then I saw it, a narrow opening. The venture required additional capital injection within the next quarter to secure the third acquisition. That meant Daniel would need formal consent on several restructuring documents, including mine. He couldn't accelerate without my signature. For the first time, the leverage wasn't theoretical. It was procedural. I could continue signing passively, reinforcing the imbalance. Or I could pause the momentum until transparency was negotiated. Both options would change the atmosphere of our marriage, one subtly, one permanently. I closed the notebook and sat in silence. I still loved him. That was the complicated truth. I loved his ambition, his energy. The father was to our children. But love without alignment becomes erosion. The decision wasn't about punishment, it was about posture. Would I remain the steady foundation beneath decisions I didn't shape? Or would I require partnership, even if it risked discomfort? The next morning, Daniel mentioned he'd bring home new documents soon. I smiled gently. Good, I said. We'll review them together. He nodded absent-mindedly, not registering the shift in language. We, not you. That was my decision, irreversible in its own quiet way. Because once you claim your seat at the table, you cannot go back to standing behind the chair. Once I made the decision, I didn't announce it. I operationalized it. There's something profoundly stabilizing about choosing your posture before the moment arrives. It removes drama. It replaces emotion with sequence. Over the next 2 weeks, I prepared without altering my tone at home. I scheduled a formal follow-up consultation with the solicitor, this time specifically about drafting a post-nuptial agreement template. Not to file immediately, but to understand the architecture. What protections were negotiable? What leverage mattered most? What timing created the strongest position? The answer, unsurprisingly, was alignment with financial dependency. In other words, when expansion requires your cooperation. Daniel mentioned the upcoming documents casually one evening while loading the dishwasher. It's just procedural, he said. We'll need to sign before the end of the month. I noticed the word. Perhaps he'd picked it up unconsciously from me. Of course, I replied calmly. Let's set aside time to go through everything properly. He paused slightly. It's standard language, he said. Nothing new. I'm sure, I answered gently. But I'd like to understand it fully this time. This time, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual. He studied my face for a moment, as if recalibrating. Then he nodded. All right, he said. That's fair? Fair. The word felt steady. In parallel, I made quieter adjustments. I redirected a portion of my tutoring income directly into my independent savings account, increased the emergency buffer, updated my CV, not to send anywhere yet, but to remind myself that I possess skills beyond the domestic sphere. I also requested copies of our most recent tax filings under the pretense of organizing digital records. Daniel sent them without hesitation. He still trusted my steadiness. He just hadn't realized steadiness could include boundaries. One Saturday afternoon, while the children were at a birthday party, the new documents arrived via email. Daniel opened them at the kitchen island, scrolling quickly. All straightforward, he muttered. We just need to initial here and here. I walked over with 2 mugs of tea and sat beside him. Let's print them, I said softly. I prefer paper. He raised an eyebrow, slightly amused. You've changed, he said lightly. Have I? I replied. A bit more thorough. I met his eyes calmly. That's not a bad thing. He didn't argue. We printed the documents, and for the first time in years, I read every page beside him. Not after, not separately, not summarized. Together. When I reached the clauses regarding extended liability thresholds, I paused. These exposure caps are higher than the previous round, I said evenly. He shifted in his seat. It's temporary, he explained. Once acquisition stabilizes, we refinance. I'd like to see that modeled, I replied. Best case and worst case. Silence settled between us. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. Daniel wasn't used to being questioned at this depth in real time. I can ask Tom to send projections, he said. Please do, I answered. No accusation, no raised voice, just a requirement. That evening, he was quieter than usual. Not angry. Processing. For the first time, momentum had met friction. Not aggressive resistance. Structured pause. And here's what I understood in that moment. Moving in silence doesn't mean avoiding confrontation forever. It means choosing the terrain before stepping onto it. By the time Daniel realized I was no longer signing reflexively, I had already secured independent counsel, built a modest financial buffer, mapped the legal structure, clarified my own threshold. So when the consequences began, and they would, I would not be reacting. I would be positioned. He still believed this was a conversation about paperwork. I knew it was a conversation about power, and power shifts quietly before it becomes visible. The projections arrived 3 days later. Daniel forwarded them to me without commentary. Spreadsheets, cash flow forecasts, optimistic growth curves. I printed them the same way I'd printed the contracts, laid them across the dining table, and began reading carefully. There's something sobering about numbers stripped of enthusiasm. Best case scenarios are always persuasive. Worst case scenarios are always quieter. When Daniel came home that evening, I had sticky notes marking 3 sections. Can we go through this? I asked gently. He loosened his tie, glanced at the papers, and sighed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Clara, it's all standard forecasting. I know, I replied. But these liquidity assumptions depend on uninterrupted sales velocity. That's the plan. And if velocity slows? He rubbed his forehead. It won't. That's not what I asked. The air shifted, not sharply, just enough to register. For the first time, I wasn't asking to be reassured. I was asking to be answered. Daniel sat down across from me. He leaned forward, scanning the projections again as if seeing them differently now that I had isolated the variables. There's always risk, he admitted finally. I understand that, I said calmly. But this clause ties the house if cumulative shortfalls exceed the threshold. He looked at me, surprised. You've really gone through this? Yes, not defensive, just factual. He leaned back, studying me. You don't trust me? He asked quietly. It wasn't an accusation, it was confusion. And that's when I felt the first ripple of consequence. Not financial, but relational. I trust you, I said carefully. But trust doesn't replace understanding. Silence lingered between us. He wasn't used to this version of me. Measured, informed, unwilling to dissolve into reassurance. I've always handled this, he said. I know, I replied. And I've always supported it. But handling something and sharing it aren't the same. He didn't argue. He didn't explode. He just grew still. Over the next week, I noticed small changes. He took more calls in the study instead of the patio. He asked a few more clarifying questions during partner meetings. He mentioned risk mitigation in conversations where he previously spoke only of expansion. Momentum had slowed, not dramatically but perceptibly. His partner, Tom, apparently noticed. At dinner one night, Daniel said casually, Tom thinks we're being overly cautious about the third acquisition. We. There it was again. What did you tell him? I asked. That we're reviewing exposure, he said. Reviewing exposure. Language had shifted. Daniel wasn't angry with me, but he was unsettled because the dynamic he had relied on, automatic reinforcement, was no longer predictable. And unpredictability in partnership forces recalibration. One evening, he said something that revealed more than he intended. You've been different lately, he observed quietly. How? More analytical? I smiled faintly. I've always been analytical. He held my gaze longer than usual. Yes, he admitted. You have. That acknowledgement carried weight, not as a victory, but as recognition. The consequence wasn't an argument, it was a disruption. The system we'd unconsciously built, where he expanded and I absorbed, no longer functioned smoothly, and systems resist change. I could see it in his posture, in the way he double checks emails before sending them, in how he began looping me into certain updates without being prompted. He wasn't panicking, but he was aware. And awareness is uncomfortable when you're accustomed to control. What he didn't yet understand was that this wasn't sabotage. It was an equilibrium. For years, my silence had allowed acceleration without friction. Now, my presence introduced deliberation. And deliberation feels like a loss when you're used to momentum. He wasn't losing me, but he was losing the version of me that never required adjustment. And that loss had begun. The panic didn't arrive in the form of shouting. It arrived as an urgency. 2 weeks after our conversation over the projections, Daniel came home earlier than usual. His energy was different. Not excited, not relaxed, tight. We need to move quickly, he said, placing his bag down with unusual care. The sellers want confirmation by Friday. Confirmation of what? I asked calmly. The third acquisition. If we hesitate, we lose the deal. I closed the book I was reading and gave him my full attention. And the revised exposure models? I asked. He exhaled slowly. We can manage it. That's not what I asked. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I hadn't seen in years. They're workable, he said. It's aggressive, but workable. I stood and walked to the kitchen table, where the documents were still neatly organized in a folder. Workable under which conditions? I asked. He stared at me for a long moment. You've changed the tempo, he said quietly. No, I replied gently. I've changed my participation. That's when I saw it. Not anger, not betrayal. Fear. Not fear of me leaving. Fear of momentum collapsing. He sat down heavily. Tom says we can't stall again, he admitted. Investors are watching. Investors are watching. I nodded slowly. And I'm responsible for the risk tied to this house, I said evenly. So I'm watching too. The room felt smaller, but not hostile, just real. For the first time, Daniel was facing the structural truth he'd minimized for months. My signature wasn't procedural. It was pivotal. Are you refusing? He asked, almost cautiously. I'm requesting restructuring, I said calmly. Adjusted liability caps, defined exit protections, transparent reporting cadence. The words didn't tremble. I had rehearsed nothing, but I had prepared everything. He leaned back, stunned. That would signal weakness, he said. To whom? I asked softly. He didn't answer immediately, because the real answer wasn't about business. It was about the image. He had built his expansion narrative on decisiveness, on speed, on confidence. My conditions introduced limits. Limits feel like loss when you're accustomed to freedom. Why now? He asked quietly. The question wasn't accusatory. It was wounded. Because I finally understand what I'm signing, I replied. Silence. He looked down at the documents as if they transformed. I was protecting you, he said, almost offensively. I know, I answered. But protection without consent isn't protection. That's when it became clear. It wasn't just about the acquisition. It was about years of unilateral framing. He could renegotiate the deal, but he couldn't undo the realization that I had been structurally sidelined. That awareness doesn't disappear, even if the numbers adjust. I can talk to Tom, he said finally. See what flexibility exists. I nodded. I'm not trying to stop you, I said. I'm asking to stand beside you. The tragedy, if there was one, wasn't that the deal might collapse. It was that the version of our marriage built on silent trust was already gone. He could restructure contracts. He couldn't restore the innocence of assumed compliance. And that's what felt too late. Not because I wanted distance, but because once clarity enters a relationship, you can't return to blurred lines. Daniel wasn't furious. He was shaken because he realized something difficult. The foundation he relied on had boundaries, and boundaries, when introduced after years of access, feel like withdrawal. But they're not. They're recalibrating. Whether he could accept that recalibration remained uncertain. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost quiet enough to miss. No slammed doors, no raised voices, no ultimatums thrown across the kitchen. Just two adults sitting at opposite ends of a polished wooden table, looking at the architecture of their marriage as if seeing it for the first time. Daniel had spoken with Tom. Negotiations were tense. Investors were impatient. The third acquisition would either move forward under revised terms or dissolve. He looked exhausted when he came home that Thursday. They think I'm hesitating, he said flatly. That I've lost conviction. I folded my hands calmly. Have you? I asked. His jaw tightened slightly. No, I just... He paused. I didn't anticipate resistance at home. There it was. Resistance. I held his gaze. I'm not your opposition, I said gently. I'm your partner. That's not how it feels, he admitted. How does it feel? He searched for the words. It feels like you waited, he said finally. Like you let me build all of this and then decided to slow it down. His observation was sharp and partially true. I didn't wait to trap you, I replied. I waited to understand. Silence stretched between us. I thought you trusted me, he said quietly. I did, I answered. Completely. And that's why I didn't read closely before. That sentence landed harder than an accusation would have. He leaned back, absorbing it. You're saying this is my fault, he said, not angrily, just wounded. No, I replied steadily. I'm saying it was our pattern. You led. I supported. It worked until the stakes grew. He looked down at the documents again. You could have spoken up sooner. Yes, I agreed. That acknowledgement softened something in him, because confrontation without heat requires shared responsibility. I didn't realize you felt sidelined, he admitted. I didn't realize I was, I said honestly. That was the truest part. For years, I had mistaken accommodation for strength. He had mistaken silence for consent. Neither of us had intended an imbalance. But intention doesn't erase impact. What happens if I can't get the revised terms? He asked quietly. The question wasn't about the deal. It was about us. Then you choose, I said calmly. the acquisition, or structural safety. He swallowed. You'd walk away over this? I shook my head gently. I'd walk away from being structurally exposed without voice. That's different. The room felt very still. No one was winning. No one was losing. We were simply confronting reality without theatrics. He studied me carefully. Not the way he used to, with easy confidence, but with reassessment. You're not threatening, he said slowly. No. You're not angry. No. Then what is this? I held his gaze. This is me refusing to be invisible in decisions that affect my future. There was no triumph in saying it, only steadiness. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, I don't want to build something that costs us this. US. The word sounded different now, more deliberate. The confrontation didn't end with an embrace. It ended with understanding. Fragile, incomplete, but real. The dynamic had shifted permanently. Whether the business deal survived was secondary. What mattered was this: I had spoken without heat, and he had listened without defense. Sometimes, dominance isn't about overpowering, it's about remaining calm when the structure trembles. And I was very, very calm. The deal did not collapse, but it did change. Revised caps were negotiated. Exposure thresholds were reduced. Reporting structures became formalized. My signature remained on the documents, but under terms I had read, shaped, and understood. From the outside, nothing dramatic happened. We didn't separate. We didn't sell the house. We didn't become a cautionary tale whispered about at dinner parties. But something irreversible had shifted. Daniel no longer introduced me as the steady one who keeps everything running. Now, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with quiet pride, he says, Clara handles the strategic side at home. It's not entirely accurate. I don't handle it alone. We do. That distinction matters. Our conversations are slower now, more deliberate. There are pauses where assumptions used to live. There are questions where summaries used to be delivered. At first, that slowness felt uncomfortable to him. Momentum had been his identity. But gradually, he began to see something I had known for months. Deliberation doesn't weaken ambition, it stabilizes it. As for me, I'm not louder than before. I haven't reinvented myself into someone confrontational or hardened. I still pack lunches. I still remember dentist appointments. I still sit beside him on the sofa in the evenings. But I no longer shrink my awareness to preserve peace. I no longer sign reflexively. I no longer mistake silence for virtue. The greatest change isn't in our finances, it's in my posture. I sit differently at the table now. Not physically, but internally. I speak earlier in conversations. I ask for documentation without apology. I hold eye contact a little longer when something doesn't align. And the surprising truth, there's less tension than before. Because hidden imbalance creates more strain than visible negotiation ever could. Daniel once asked me, months after everything settled, were you ever planning to leave? I considered the question carefully. No, I answered honestly. But I was preparing to. He nodded slowly. I didn't see it coming. I know, I said gently. That's the thing about quiet shifts. They don't announce themselves with warning sirens. They happen internally first. I married for love. I stayed for responsibility. And somewhere in between, I learned that responsibility must include yourself. Letting go isn't always easier than staying. In my case, staying required more courage. Not the courage to endure, the courage to redefine. I'm still a wife, still a mother, still the calm presence people underestimate. But I'm also informed, positioned, unwilling to disappear inside someone else's momentum. And perhaps the most powerful part of this entire journey is this: I didn't win. I didn't defeat anyone. I simply stepped into visibility within my own life. And once you do that, you cannot unknow your worth. If you had met me 5 years ago, you would have seen a woman who looked content. And I was, just not complete. There's a quiet danger in being the dependable one, the calm one, the one who never overreacts, never complicates things, never demands clarification. People begin to assume your silence is proof of comfort. They build around it. They expand on top of it. And if you're not careful, you start believing that your value lies in how little space you take up. I married for love. That part was real. It still is. I stayed for responsibility, for my children, for the life we built, for the vows I took seriously. But what I questioned in between was this: was I staying out of strength or out of habit? Was I being loyal or avoiding discomfort? Letting go isn't always easier than staying. Sometimes, staying is the harder choice, especially when staying requires you to change the terms of your presence. What I learned is this: silence can be grace, but silence can also be erasure. Support can be love, but support without visibility becomes an imbalance. And trust, real trust, is not the absence of questions. It is the willingness to answer them. I didn't burn my marriage down. I didn't issue ultimatums. I didn't seek revenge for being underestimated. I simply refused to continue participating in my own diminishment. And the moment I shifted from reactive quiet to intentional presence, everything recalibrated. Not instantly, not perfectly, but permanently. If you see yourself in parts of this story, if you've ever been the steady one, the easy one, the reliable foundation beneath someone else's ambition, I want to leave you with one gentle truth. You are allowed to understand what you're signing. You are allowed to ask for structure. You are allowed to require partnership, not just appreciation. Calm doesn't mean compliant. Soft doesn't mean small. So I'll ask you this, not dramatically, not judgmentally, just honestly. Have you ever confused endurance with love? And if so, what would change if you chose clarity instead? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.